This is my Christmas story, a gift from a friend. I don't even know why we come to work on December 24th. We hung around the downtown Dallas office for a couple of hours, not getting much, if any, work done, while we talked about last Sunday's game, and we drank coffee with a little extra shot added from a semi-hidden bottle. Maybe an illicit affair was going on in the stock room. We don't ask and we don't tell. There were a few decorations hanging over office doors. There was a holiday tree in the lobby, a Hanukkah menorah in Silverstein's office window. Something to do with Ramadan and Kwanzaa decorated a few offices. Everything was covered but Christ. The use of the word Christmas or anything to do with the Nativity was off limits. We didn't want to offend anybody. They're trying so hard to be politically correct, I'm surprised they don't ask Tom Christian to change his name, or at least ask him to take his name off his door. It doesn't matter to me one way or another, but it seems these days the only people who think about Christ at Christmas are the atheists, who are trying to get him totally removed from the holidays. Anyway, this was our office party while we waited for the catered lunch to be brought in. And then about 2 o'clock we began to leave, full of holiday sauce and spirits of Christmas past. Holidays past. I headed for Pacific Avenue, where I would catch the train to head for the suburbs and then home. The air was cool but not cold, so I wore a light jacket to keep my load light. I didn't even bring my computer to work today because I knew I wouldn't need it. The train heading north showed up about 2:29, right on time. It was slightly crowded with slightly inebriated people. Some were loosened up enough that they were talking to each other, but mostly it was the standard routine. People trying hard not to make eye contact as they stared out the window or read the signpost on the walls. If you did look at someone, you made it a glance, and if they happened to catch you, you quickly averted your eyes. The trip was uneventful as I tried hard to stay awake. If you fall asleep on the train, you might get your pockets picked. Of course, that might happen even if you stay awake. When the train left downtown and entered the tunnel, it was amazing how many people continued to look out the window, even though it was pitch black. But I have to confess, I used that time to look at other people via the reflection in the glass. I'm sure nobody else does that, just me. At the City Place station, I noticed a young man get on the train. He was very familiar with his long hair and scraggly beard. He didn't look like he could afford a ticket for the train and probably hadn't purchased one. The homeless ride the train all the time. They seem to know when the DART police are about, if they even care. A night in jail out of the cold and free meals is probably a plus in their lives. The young vagabond looked about 18 or 19, and I realized why he seemed so familiar. He reminded me too much of myself when I was his age, what I refer to as my hippie years, when I was wandering about aimlessly searching for something. We called it trying to find ourselves. We didn't realize there was no self to be found. Self was already inside us and we were running from it, not toward it. We were either unable to see or refused to see the truth that we carry around with us from the moment of our conception. When I was that age, I knew exactly what was wrong with the world and I let everybody know. I also knew how to change it. So why didn't I? Because it required too much work and I just wanted to hang out, get high, have fun. So needless to say, I never changed the world, and I was assuming this young man wouldn't either. As I watched him walk over and take the seat right beside me, I looked around and realized there were people standing. Why was there even a vacant seat next to me? And that thought quickly left me when he sat down. He smelled bad and his stomach was making very strange noises. But despite that, I felt oddly drawn to him. I felt compassion for him, an emotion I rarely, if ever, have for anyone outside my immediate family. What was it about this young man? Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. "It sounds like your stomach needs some food in it," I said kind of awkwardly. He kind of shrugged and said, I ate some apples yesterday." He was wearing a long, ragged cloth coat, but I could tell he was skinny. Not slim skinny, but skin and bones skinny. Now, I don't normally help people like him, and when I do, I never give them money to help a habit or an addiction. But I really felt compelled to help this young man, this kid. "Up here at the next stop, let's get off and I'll buy you something to eat." He nodded his head and closed his eyes. I looked at him a moment and then turned back to the darkness outside the window. I realized what was so familiar about him. It wasn't just that he reminded me of myself at that age. He looked like me at that age. At the Mockingbird station, we pushed our way past the people getting on the train and stepped into the cool air. I looked around this new/old part of Dallas. I used to live a couple of blocks from where we stood near Central Expressway and Mockingbird Lane. It sure has changed. I go by here twice a day and I never pay any real attention to it. It's just been here all my life, and like anything that you're around all the time, you never really notice the changes. There were several eating establishments within a block of the train station. We could see a Burger King about a block away on the corner of Mockingbird and Macmillan. I said we would go there and I'd buy him a hamburger and some french fries, and he just said, "Okay." I told him how this area had changed. Across the street from us was where Dr. Pepper plant used to be. The clock that used to be on the old building was now a small monument about a block away. Instead of fixing the old clock, they just put a digital clock with red LED lights beside it. My, how we have compacted our history into small packages. So it's gone, but it's not forgotten. He seemed slightly bored as I said that Roscoe White's Drive-In used to be where we were walking. And then I explained that a drive-in was one of those places where you stayed in the car and they brought a tray and hung it on the window. My family used to eat here often. And then there was the Egyptian room in the middle of the block that had Italian cuisine. I never did understand that. What's amazing is the Egyptian room is still there. I wonder if it's still an Italian restaurant. I asked him if he remembered the Mrs. Baird's Bakery on the other side of Central Expressway. Since it had only been a couple of years since I thought that it was gone, I thought he might. He shook his head and basically he ignored me. The smell of baking bread still takes me back to my childhood and those carefree days before I started school. I would sit on the lawn beside our house, which sloped down to the freeway, and I would watch for my grandfather's furniture truck. He would stop by on his way between the suburb store and the downtown store. He would pull over on the shoulder of the highway and walk up the slope just to say hi and give me a penny and a nickel for Ice Cream Man. And then he would be on his way. The young man seemed indifferent to my stories. He either didn't care or he just thought I was boring. Listening to my dull drone of a voice was just the price that he had to pay to get something to eat. We finally made our way through the crowded parking lot of the small shopping center and entered the Burger King. The young man looked at the menu and I told him to order whatever he wanted, that I would be right back. I really had to use the restroom. Too much coffee and Kahlua back at the office party, you know. Less than 5 minutes later, I returned and he was gone. And then the strangest thing happened. I asked the kid behind the counter about the young man who came in with me, and he told me I came in alone. I tried to argue with him, but he seemed pretty convinced that I did indeed come in alone. I looked around one more time, and then I stepped outside. And then things really got weird. At first I thought they were having a parade of old cars. The newest one I saw was a '54 Chevy. I turned back around and the Burger King was gone. I was standing in the parking lot of Roscoe White's Drive-In, looking at the skyline where a few minutes ago the Hotel Palomar had stood. At 8 stories high, it had blocked out a big chunk of the western sky. It was quite obvious by its absence, at least to me. No one else seemed to care. It was like it had never been there. And then I became aware of a honking horn. A family in a 49 Mercury wanted to pull into the parking place where I was standing. I moved out of their way and headed down the sidewalk in front of the Egyptian room. I looked at the people walking by me. The men were dressed in dark suits and were wearing fedoras, most of them. The women were dressed, well, like women dressed when I was a little kid. It was all too elaborate to be a hoax. They were all looking at me like I was the one who was out of place. I was mesmerized as I walked up Mockingbird toward Greenville Avenue. My brain was working overtime, trying to take it all in. When I approached the intersection, the first thing I noticed on the northeast corner was a Christmas tree lot with a few trees left on it, and the sign, yes, the sign read, "Christmas trees." Everywhere I looked, Christ was in Christmas. I'd forgotten all about the young man who was the reason I was here in the first place. I was a bit taken aback, to say the least, when I noticed the elephant in the hall. I had just walked past it and hadn't even noticed. The Dr. Pepper plant was standing in its full glory. Its employee parking lot full of very old cars. I never saw so many cars from the 30s and 40s, at least not since I was a little kid. I almost got hit by one of those old cars when I stepped backwards off the curb into a busy Greenville Avenue. I hardly even noticed the car when it locked its brakes and its tires screeched. I had just seen the Dallas Times-Herald in a vending machine. I hadn't even noticed the headlines. All I saw was the date, December 24th, 1954. All I really wanted to do at that moment was get back on the train, but there was no train. There was no train station. I could see the SMU campus in the distance across Central Expressway because there was nothing any longer blocking the view. Everything was exactly the way it was when I was 5 years old, except I wasn't 5 years old. I just stood there on the corner of Greenville and Mockingbird. I had the strangest sensation inside my head. It was empty of memories. The memories were all on the outside. Have you ever just had one of those days where you asked yourself, why am I here? Well, I was having one of those days. I finally came to what was left of my senses. I knew I couldn't just stand there, but where would I go? Home? Where was home? And then I remembered where home was on December 24th, 1954. I remembered it very well, but not from inside my head. It was outside my head. I looked south on Greenville Avenue, and without really thinking about it, I began to walk. I could see the neon lights from the Granada movie theater several blocks away. I remember it being at the end of the street that we lived on, Longview Street. Everywhere I looked, I saw Christmas. Christmas was everywhere. Christ was everywhere. I saw a few menorahs, but nothing about Ramadan. And in 1954, Kwanzaa hadn't even been made up yet. Christmas was about Christ. I couldn't walk a block without seeing at least one nativity scene. When I reached Longview Street, I felt like I was in a trance. It was Christmas Eve, 1954, and my 5-year-old self lived in a 2-story duplex at the end of this street. I was compelled to continue on into what? I had no idea. There was no fear in me. In fact, I was filled with a joyous exuberance. I wanted to see what was down that street. The wind was cool, but I felt strangely warm as I glanced at the movie marquee. Sabrina, starring Audrey Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart, was showing at the Granada. I never did see that movie, I thought, as I started my feet walking toward the unknown. The street hadn't changed one bit since I was here last, some 52 years ago. I know exactly what I was thinking and doing on that Christmas Eve because it was the same thing I did every Christmas Eve. I was watching every endless minute tick as I waited for that unbelievably long day to pass so we could go to my grandparents' house and open gifts. That was the reason it used to be called a magical time. I stopped walking as I neared the end of the street. The smell of baking bread was wafting across the expressway from Mrs. Baird's bakery. A small boy riding a broomstick horse was coming toward me. I would have known that little boy anywhere, with his rags wrapped around the stick horse for a saddle and ropes for a bridle and reins, standing there with his cowboy hat and boots, wearing a Jingles jacket. He said, "Whoa," as he stopped his horse and looked at me and smiled, and then he turned around and he galloped away. I continued to walk on behind him until he stopped in front of the last house on the right. He got off his horse and onto a small bicycle with training wheels. I stopped about 10 feet away. "Are you lost, mister?" he asked. I had to think about it. "I'm not sure," I answered. He looked puzzled by my answer. When you're 5 years old, people are either lost or they're not. "I'm going to Mommy and Papa's house tonight," he told me. "That's what I call my grandmother and grandfather." I nodded. "I know." He tilted his head to one side. "You do?" Then he squinted his eyes and tilted his head to the other side. "Do I know you?" I smiled at him. "Not yet, but you will one day." And two, when you're 5 years old, adults are always saying things that you don't understand, so instead of trying to, you just move on. And that's what he did as he told me, "I'm going to go in and try to go to sleep so the time will pass faster." I almost laughed. I never could make myself go to sleep on Christmas Eve, but every year I tried. And every year I just laid there wide awake. "Believe me," I said, "the time will pass very fast." And then he hit me right between the eyes when out of the clear blue he asked, "Did you know Jesus was born tonight?" Then I did what I always do when I feel trapped. I talk too much. "Well, we don't know for sure he was born on December 25th. In fact, he may have been born," and I stopped. He was looking at me like I was a fool. "What?" I had to ask. "Jesus was born tonight," he said adamantly. "Mr. Fuller said it, and I believe it." Who's Mr. Fuller? The name was tickling my memory files. "Mr. Fuller is my Sunday school teacher, and he tells me Bible stories. The Bible says Jesus was born tonight." "Well," I began, "I don't think the Bible says..." I stopped myself again. Why had I become so analytical about everything in my life? Why couldn't I just accept things with that childlike innocence I used to have? I looked at my 5-year-old face. Whatever happened to my faith? What difference does it make what exact day Jesus was born on? The important thing is to believe he was born. "You keep listening to Mr. Fuller," I said to my small self. "Mr. Fuller is a very wise man." "Yeah," he grinned, "I like him. He lets me draw pictures. I like to draw pictures. Here, I'll show you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a partly folded, partly wadded up piece of paper. He opened it up and handed it to me. It was a picture of the baby Jesus in a manger with a whole entourage of people and animals around him. I had forgotten. I was a pretty good artist. "You can keep it," he told me. "I can draw another one." I felt a tear roll down my cheek. Whatever happened to that generous nature? Whatever happened to my child? "Why are you crying?" he asked. Are you sad?" It was my turn to grin. "No, I'm not sad at all. I was just remembering someone I used to know." I folded the picture back up, and as I pushed it into my pocket, I told him, "Thank you." "Well, you're welcome, mister." He pulled the drawstring of his cowboy hat up tight under his chin before he added, "I gotta go in now." And then he got a serious look on his face. It's going to be okay. Jesus will take care of you." He turned and headed for the front porch of the duplex. I couldn't remember which side we lived on. Oh yeah, the right. He stopped and he looked back at me and he waved. "I'll see you," he said, and he was gone. I stood there a moment as if in a dream. I finally closed my eyes and whispered, "Jesus, please help me. I don't ever want to forget you. Please help my unbelief." I took a deep breath and I opened my eyes. I was standing in front of a long row of apartments with an iron fence and gated driveways. As I looked back up the street toward Greenville Avenue, it looked different. The trees were all much bigger. Many of them weren't even there a minute ago. Many of the houses that were still in the street were remodeled or new. I had the feeling that it was no longer 1954. I wanted to stand there and try to figure out what had just happened, but I had this urge to go. I walked back up Longview one block and turned left on Glencoe Street. That took me past the park where I used to go and find golf balls that the golf practitioners couldn't find after they hit them. The park was now full of yuppies with their fancy pure-breed dogs strutting around, showing off in front of each other, and I don't mean the dogs. I was soon on Macmillan, and I slowed down as I went by the Burger King just to see if my young friend was there. He never did get anything to eat. Perhaps he didn't really need it. I sat on the next train heading toward home, wondering what had happened. Had I dreamed it? Was it a hallucination? Was it real or not? That's not the question. The question is, why did it happen? I don't think this happened so I would remember the me I used to be. I think it happened so I would remember the Jesus that I used to know. The Jesus who has so slowly and subtly over the years been pushed out of Christmas until soon no one remembers that he's the reason for the season. The Jesus who has so slowly and subtly been pushed from our lives until soon no one even remembers that he's the reason for our lives. Christmas, like our lives, used to be the innocence of children and the ever-presence of Jesus. What Christmas has become is not even Christmas anymore. It's just another holiday. What our lives has become is not even life anymore. It's just existence. I met the Christ that I used to know in the child that I used to be. So if I may be so bold as to say, don't forget the child you used to be and the Jesus that you used to know. Well, the train stopped and I saw a dark policeman getting on, so I instinctively reached in my pocket to make sure I still had my ticket. My hand touched a piece of folded paper. I pulled it out and opened it up. It was the most beautiful nativity scene that I'd ever had the pleasure of seeing. It was a gift from a friend.